Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia SEM-V tutorial series. Today we're going to take our first look at some of the more advanced features of the synthesizer. If you're enjoying this series, check out the Patreon or YouTube channel member links below to help support me and carry on making content like this. The first section we're going to have a look at today is the arpeggiator, and I'm really only going to spend a very short amount of time on it because it's so simple. But that doesn't mean to say it's not capable of making some great sounds. What an arpeggiator basically does is breaks up a chord that you've played, plays each of the individual notes according to specified criteria. So you can specify the direction in which the notes are going to be played. I'll just turn the rate down to make it nice and slow. So it's going to break a C major chord up that I'm about to play into its component notes. So that was me just pressing the chord down on the keyboard, and then the synthesizer breaks it up into those notes. If I span that over 2 octaves, really pretty obvious what that's doing. Random does exactly what it says on the tin. It plays all of the notes randomly. If I turn sync on, then it locks it to the host BPM, so we're now in 1/16. So that's 16th notes according to the host DAW's tempo of 110. And if I press hold, I don't need to keep the keys held down, the synthesizer will do it for me. And that's really all the amount of time we need to spend on the arpeggiator. It's too simple to dwell on or spend an awful long time breaking down what's really a pretty obvious module. We should be able to say the same for Portamento, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that because the timing reading on this knob is a little bit misleading. What Portamento does is basically glide from one note to the next. I've just turned it on and I'll dial in. I'm just going to set it to 1/3 of the dial and not worry about what the time says. And now if I press notes on the keyboard, you can hear that effect. The problem comes when you try to make sense of what the timing says. So if I set it to, let's say, 250 milliseconds, 1/4 of a second, I'm going to press a C on the keyboard and hold it down for a little while. Watch the tuner, and we're basically going to settle out at 261 Hz, which is the pitch of that note. Now this is set to 1/4 of a second. I'm going to play a note an octave away. Watch the tuner, and we'll kind of count mentally. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Took, 5-6 seconds, something like that, to get to the octave. This millisecond counter, I've basically derived empirically that it's something along the lines of 250 milliseconds per semitone, but it also seems to be logarithmic. So as it approaches the final destination where the note is supposed to be pitched to, it seems to slow down. So there's something a little bit weird going on here, but if I set it to a second and come back down to the C an octave below, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and you can see it slowing down. And as I get to 12, there or thereabouts, counting to 12 very roughly, it's pretty much covered the octave. So a bit weird, but there you go. That's how Portamento's implemented. But what I really want to spend most of today talking about is a couple of the advanced features. I'm going to press this advanced button at the top, and it opens a new bespoke window. Now, none of this functionality existed in the original SEM. This is all Arturia stuff. And today we're going to have a look at keyboard follow and the 8-voice programmer. Key follow first. The key follow is basically a modulation control that depends upon the pitch of the note that you've played. So we have a scale here. Each time I press a key on the keyboard, I'm just going to get back to a completely default sound just in case I've messed with anything down below. Every time I press a key, you can see this strobed line appear. So there's the lowest key on my keyboard, and I'll play a note 3 octaves higher, and it's there. So you can see the note on the lower keyboard that covers that range. What we can now do is plug in 6 different modulation targets to be affected by the pitch of the note that we play. So if I turn on VCF frequency, and by the way, these are only defaults, you can click on them to select from a larger range of options, but I'm going to leave it in VCF frequency. And if I press the little pencil, it means I'm editing. It is highlighted, it's not very dark, but this is now the highlighted option. I can now plug in the low C just by clicking in the screen. You can have up to 32 steps in this thing. I'm going to get rid of that one in the middle. And there's where I want my upper range to be. So I'll pick this node up and drag it there. So now the frequency, the filter frequency, is going to vary from its minimum extent to its maximum extent around the currently selected value. So just to derive a baseline, I'll turn this feature off so key follow isn't in operation. All of the notes are of the same general frequency, the filter cutoff is the same across the board. Now I'll turn key follow on. The low notes will be much duller and the high notes will be much brighter. Now we can do something very cool with VCF frequency for key follow when it comes to resonance. I'm just going to turn it off again for a moment and introduce a huge amount of resonance so that we self-oscillate. That sharp, harsh note is always the same. It's always the same frequency. It's centered around the cutoff 2.5 kilohertz. So that really piercing sound that you're hearing is the same across the keyboard range. So I'll just do a slide down across those 3 octaves. You hear that constant high-pitched whistle at the same tone. Now if I engage key follow, the resonance will track as I do that slide down and it sounds much cooler. And the reason we're getting that effect is because the filter frequency is being swept through the range as I press the keys, and so that resonant peak also tracks with the filter sweep. Of course, we can do pretty brutal things with keyboard follow. If I make it, if I assign it to VCO1 coarse, instead this is now the pitch, the coarse pitch tuning. So if I start drawing in some crazy shapes over that range, and again I'll do a 3 octave slide down. So now I've got an almost random note generator on my keyboard as I press a chord. And I'm getting all sorts of crazy things because each of those individual notes in the chord is being modulated to a different amount. So it's a really powerful engine, and the ability to tie in 6 different destinations simultaneously is quite cool. Just remember to click this pencil depending on which one you're trying to edit. It's really easy to lose track, particularly because the shading is quite subtle on these effects, to think you're editing the wrong one and get yourself in a bit of trouble. Particularly annoying in this interface because there's no undo feature. All of that VCO coarse tuning, all of these little nodes that I added here, I can't get rid of them. The only way to get rid of them is to right click on each node individually. So maybe get into the habit of saving your preset before you go into this window. So if you make a complete mess of it, you can get back to your initial point very quickly. The other option to look at today is the 8-voice programmer. Now when we were talking about the oscillators, I described how the synthesizer has multiple voices, but it's more complicated than that because each voice is capable of being assigned to a particular task. What I'm going to do to demonstrate this is firstly just press the note C on the keyboard multiple times. See that light that's lighting up? That's indicating the voice that's currently being used to generate that particular note. So the synthesizer's basically got these 8 internal voices available for use, and each time I press a new note, it basically takes the next available voice and uses that to generate the note, and we can use that to achieve modulation effects. So let's dial in some different amounts of filter for 4 different notes. What I also need to do for this demonstration purposes is turn the other 4 steps off because I want to make sure it only cycles around this zone. Now what I'm going to do is basically play a C major 7, but I don't know which voice is going to get assigned the next slot. Happens to be voice number 1. It won't be the next time I press the note. Now if I start playing 3 note chords, you can hear that they sound different each time I play them because 3 different modulation amounts are being applied to each of those 3 notes in turn. But this programmer isn't usually used for such dramatic purposes. What you'll generally see it do more often, I'll turn all 8 back on, is generate subtle effects like this. And now Each note is just very slightly different from the last one, and you get a more interesting dynamic. A nice example that I found of the programmer being used subtly is a preset unsubtly called Assless Synth. And you can see that there are 5 modules engaged, but when you actually look at the edit screens for them, VCF mode isn't used, so we can ignore that one. However, all of the other 4 are, and you can see that all of their settings are quite subtle. So what I'll do is I'll play the preset as it comes out of the box. Now I'll turn the programmer off. You can hear how much thinner that sound is. All of those subtle little modulations that are being applied to the VCF frequency, resonance, the sustain, the length of each note that's being played, how much VCO2 is being mixed into the sound, all of these subtle changes being made across the programmer. Every time I press a new key, a new voice is being used and a very slightly different effect is being generated. And it makes for a much nicer sound. I've just got back to my standard sawtooth wave again, so that I can talk about another feature of the 8-voice programmer. Everything that we've seen so far has been in forward mode. See this little drop down box, the playing mode box. But obviously we've got different parameters to choose from here. Most of them are self-evident, except reassign. This is an unusual one. I'm just going to turn the programmer on and start playing a single note. As long as I make sure I'm playing with a single digit to make sure I can't accidentally press 2 keys. As long as I only ever play a single note, it's always using voice 1. If I play a 2-note chord, it uses voice 1 for the first note and voice 2 for the second note. What this means is that we can basically generate flavour dynamics depending on how many notes we play. So if I dial in something like this and bring the basic frequency down a little bit, the first note's going to be dull, second note's going to be brighter, third note's going to be brighter still, and every 4-note chord that I play is going to follow that pattern. It's actually possible to program arpeggios with this thing as well. With VCO 1 and 2 course, I'll switch back to forward mode. Obviously, if I press a single note, it's just going to do that. But if I set each voice to different semitone offsets, you get kind of pseudo arpeggios. It's one of these modules that's only limited by your creativity. It's very powerful, and obviously with so many different modulation targets to go at, you know, there's an awful lot to play with there. Pretty cool stuff. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please hit the like button, and I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot for watching.